Now, in this section, we're looking at the right to self-determination. This is Article 1 of both the ICCPR and the ICESCR. It's one of the important reasons why so many states agreed to these treaties, because in the 1960s, when these treaties came around, they were primarily supported by developing countries, and developing countries liked them because of self-determination, because they gave rights to poor and developing countries. So remember, in the 1960s, human rights were very much in favor with Asia and Africa, and and a major reason for that was this right of self-determination. Self-determination, as we see it in the definition, basically means, let me move this, that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they can freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. They can dispose of their natural wealth, and that state parties shall promote the realization of the right to self-determination. Self-determination basically is the right to decolonize. That's how it's been understood. So a couple of important points with this. It's not an individual right, it's the right of peoples. And peoples is a plural of people, and people means a collection of individuals. So we're talking about groups of collections of people with this term peoples. So all peoples have this right to kind of pick their own political status. Now, many countries have ensured that this right to self-determination, they understand it as the right of colonized states to decolonize. So remember, in the 1950s and 60s, as this was being drafted, most countries in the world then were colonies. And that process of decolonization led towards maybe, about 100 countries became decolonized and eventually becoming individual countries. And that was primarily in Asia and Africa. And so this is part of that push in the United Nations and by these decolonizing in Asian and African countries, that we need to recognize the right that people can choose their own governments, and they should not have governments led by colonies. Now, but this definition has kind of evolved and modified over time. So now it's also used much more commonly with indigenous rights. And as I'm sure that we may discuss a bit, it's also, as you may discuss in the tutorials, it's also commonly involved in some countries like Myanmar, where there is a lot of discussion about self-determination. Okay. Now looking at the elements of self-determination. So the first one is, how do we define peoples? Now, how this has been defined is not as an ethnic group or an indigenous group, but as a political group who are kind of defined as like having an identity like a state. That means they've got to have territorial integrity, they've got to have borders, they've got to have a history of self-rule, they've got to have a functioning government, and they've got to have an international recognition. Now, these kinds of rights are based on the Montevideo Treaty on the rights and duties of states, which define what a state is itself. But it means basically, if you're going to have the right to self-determination, you've got to have those features very similar to a state, which means that you've got this kind of territorial and government identity, which has been taken over by a colony, and you then get decolonized. And the international community kind of recognizes that. So you can see like 3 of those 4 parts of that definition are kind of like factual. You either do or don't have territory, history of self-rule, and a functioning government. The international recognition is the political one, which means that states get to choose if they consider you a state or not. Now that means, for instance, Taiwan and Palestine aren't considered states, or Tibet, whereas Timor-Leste and Timor-Leste and Sarajevo and ex-parts of Yugoslavia were considered states, okay, because they were recognized internationally. And that just comes down to a political decision. The United States doesn't want to recognize Palestine, as China doesn't want to recognize Taiwan. They have the power and they can stop that international recognition. Okay. But self-determination, particularly as we see it in the region, in the Asia Pacific, is primarily around the right to decolonize. Because if we think about 1945, there were only like 3 or 4 countries in the whole region. All the other countries were colonized or they were occupied post-World War II. There's been a gradual process of decolonization from those original 3 or 4 countries to about the 50 or 60 we have now. But just identifying or defining self-determination as the right to decolonize has kind of changed and evolved as more and more kind of different cases of decolonization or of self-determination occur. So one of the first big changes was, say, when Bangladesh became its own country, because Bangladesh didn't really have a history of self-rule. You know, it was part of India, and they were part of the British Empire, then part of India, then part of Pakistan, and then it became its own country. But that was kind of out of territorial reality, that it couldn't really be part of Pakistan if it was thousands of miles away, you know, and spoke a different language and was quite different. So Bangladesh's decolonization or right to self-determination was recognized in the early 70s, even though it didn't quite fit the definition. And the same thing happened in the 1990s when Yugoslavia broke down into 6 or 7 other states like Slovakia and Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia and so on. Now the problem here was that in terms of self-determination, one of the key limitations is that they don't want to recognize state secession. That's when part of a state breaks off and becomes a new state. Because it's a big threat to many states. We see it still all around the world with, say, in Barcelona, or Catalan breaking off from Spain and Quebec breaking off from Canada, Western Sahara and Morocco. But states are kind of worried about these about state secession. And most states don't say that secession is not recognized. You've got to be a colonized country. This happened in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and again it was kind of recognized as first Slovenia broke off, followed by Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Montevideo, and so on, Montenegro, and so on. So state secession is now in some cases recognized. You know, and that's a concern for, say, Myanmar, where there are moves towards state secession there. And then finally, we have examples of self-determination through democracy, of elections or referendums, where South Sudan, Quebec, Scotland, Timor-Leste all kind of became, got this self-determination as a result of the vote. Now that wasn't originally recognised in the original definitions of self-determination, but it is now. So while Quebec and Scotland don't have their rights to self-determination, you know, Timor and South Sudan do. But who knows, maybe Scotland will vote to leave England and become its own country. Now, a further kind of evolution of self-determination is in Indigenous and other kind of forms of minority groups having rights to determine their own resources. And so this happens in Indigenous groups in Canada and America and Australia and New Zealand, and also in Scandinavian countries with the Sami, who are like the people who live near the Arctic Circle there. All of them have their rights recognized to certain kind of resources, whether it's reindeer or whether it's fish or whether it's the resources in those areas, that the Indigenous groups are recognized as being the traditional owners of that. Okay, and they should have various laws that kind of protect their resources, and also they have certain self-determination rights over their own, maybe their own education or some law systems or some other economic systems as well. So self-determination in these cases means that these Indigenous groups have more rights to kind of control their own social system in these cases. Okay, that finishes the section on self-determination.